We're going to turn to Rabbi Reuven Kimelman. I don't see Rabbi Kimelman on here, though.
Oh, he's there. I see him.
Oh, there he is. Awesome. Okay. Rabbi Reuven Kimelman is the rabbi of Beth Avraham, the Sephardic congregation in New England in Brookline, Mass. He also serves as professor of classical Judaica at Brandeis University. And Rabbi Kimelman, take it away.
So our topic today is the resurrection of the dead. Probably the strangest belief in Judaism, but affirmed over and over by the liturgy. The resurrection of the dead appears twice prominently in the liturgy. Strangely, the only group that accepted resurrection of the dead in antiquity was Rabbinic Judaism. Other expressions of Judaism, Philo, even the Dead Sea Scrolls, do not seem to accept resurrection of the dead. They prefer the immortality of the soul. The belief in the immortality of the soul was the regnant religious belief of the ancient world. So the question is, why did Chazal deviate from that? Not only deviate from that, but promote a position which is the most incredible of the two. The average person will believe in the immortality of the soul, but will raise questions about the resurrection of the dead. So if you walked in the streets of any major city and asked, what do you think is the more credible belief, the immortality of the soul or the resurrection of the dead? Probably 90% would argue for the immortality of the soul, simply because we know little about the soul and therefore able to affirm much about it. We know a lot about the body and therefore more careful in what we affirm about it. So normally a body is dead and remains dead. So then, of course, why do the rabbis promote the resurrection of the soul? In fact, it is featured more prominently, the immortality of the soul, in the daily liturgy. And where does the belief come from? So the great debate among rabbinic scholars, or biblical scholars, whether it has sufficient roots in biblical literature, specifically Hosea, Isaiah, maybe even Samuel, to explain the later belief. Most scholars think it's borrowed from Zoroastrianism, a Persian religion. But anybody who's looked at Zoroastrianism and his understanding of resurrection of the dead is so different from the rabbinic understanding, it's hard to believe that one is derivative of the other. Secondly, if Zoroastrianism had a major impact, it would be on the Jewish literature written in the Persian period, since Zoroastrianism was a Persian religion. But in the Jewish literature in the Bible written in the Persian period, for example, Ezra, Nehemiah, maybe first versions of Enoch, the Chronicles do not mention the resurrection of the dead. It is mentioned in late biblical period and primarily in Ezekiel. In chapter 37 of Ezekiel, it talks about the valley of the dry bones and their revival. Almost all classical scholars, Jewish and Christian, identified that chapter 37 with the resurrection of the dead. Almost all modern scholars identify that chapter as a metaphor for national restoration, but it's not talking about the resurrection of the dead. What's the problem? The problem is that if the revival of the body and the reconstitution of the bones of the body can be used as a metaphor for national restoration, and therefore give hope to the Jews who were in Babylon that they one day would be restored to the land of Israel, if that is the metaphorical meaning, then what is the concrete primary meaning? Metaphorical meanings are borrowed meanings. Therefore, if we borrow to get to national restoration, one may assume that the original meaning, non-metaphorical, was actually physical restoration. And therefore, it's precisely 2nd Isaiah and Ezekiel, both prophets of the exile, which may have been the greatest advocates of resurrection. In any case, the other major appearance of resurrection is in the book of Maccabees. The book of Maccabees is 300 years after the Persian period, at least, maybe even more. it's in the Greek period. So if the evidence for resurrection is pre-Persian or post-Persian and absent from Persian literature, then it's unlikely that Zoroastrianism had any impact on the resurrection of the dead. So then why did the rabbis promote it? I think it's more due to anthropology than to theology. By anthropology is the rabbis affirm the primacy of both body and soul in constituting the human body. If a person is primarily soul and secondary body, then the survival of the self can be done by the survival of the soul. But if a person is both body and soul, and the individuality of the soul or the personality of the soul only is taken on by the assumption of the body, then your sense of self is constituted by body and soul. The soul may be the source of energy for the body, but it's not you. The body also is not you. The body without a soul is a corpse, and the soul without a body is a ghost. In order to constitute the human person, we need the interaction of body and soul. It's like water. Water is hydrogen and oxygen. Oxygen does not have the qualities of water. Hydrogen does not have the qualities of water. Together and only together, they constitute water. Or we can use a computer image. There is software and hardware. Hardware without software is a piece of junk. Software without hardware is inaccessible information. What creates, as it were, artificial intelligence is integration of software and hardware. Therefore, you are constituted by body and soul. The survival of the soul is no more the survival of the specific you than the survival of the body. So I would argue that we're not talking theology, we're talking anthropology. And the religious anthropology of the rabbis understands the human being as constituted of body and soul. Now, the corollary of this is that the body is not the source of evil, and the soul is not the source of good, an assumption accepted by almost all religious thinkers of antiquity, Jewish or Christian, primarily influenced by the dichotomy of Plato. Now, if the body is not the source of evil, and the soul is not the source of evil, then what is the source of evil and good? It's called in Rabbinic anthropology the Yetzer Hara and the Yetzer HaTov. But the Yetzer Hara is not identified with the body, and the Yetzer HaTov is not identified with the soul. These psychic energies, which are either constructive or destructive, only come about by the integration of the body and soul. So one of the great differences between rabbinic understanding of anthropology and almost all other religious understandings is the unwillingness to correlate good and bad with body and soul. And once you no longer correlate good and bad with body and soul, there's no reason to argue for the immortality only of the soul and not of the body. The human being as constituted needs both. Now let's look at the actual prayers which discuss this. The first is the prayer Elohai Neshama in the text. Hope everybody has the text in front of you. This is the opening prayer. Now, at one time, this prayer was said upon awakening in the morning. But later on in the development of the Jewish liturgy, they placed Asher Yatzar, the prayer for the body and the well-functioning of the body after urination and defecation, before this prayer. So this prayer is now, in many liturgies, number 2. Number 1 is a prayer on the body. This prayer does not begin with the opening blessing formulary. Therefore, according to halachic reasoning, it ties it tightly to the preceding blessing. And therefore, these two blessings should not be conceived as two separate blessings, but two parts of a whole. So first, we thank God for a well and functioning body. and that its well-functioning manifests two things: divine wisdom or ingeniousness in the way he created the body, and mafli lasot, that he's constantly sustaining it, and the sustaining of the body as a healthy entity reflects a divine wisdom. Now comes the prayer for the soul. It starts off, Elohai, my God, line 1, Neshama shenatata bi Torah hi. This is a remarkable statement in light of many understandings of ancient religion of the soul. According to this, the soul is given by God. 2, it is pure. It is not tainted. It has no defects on it. We are given a soul in mid condition. If something goes wrong, it can only be our fault. It cannot be the fault of the giver. As the Talmud says, God asked of the human being to restore it as he received it. As he received the Torah unmarked, so should he return it. So the opening line, Torahi, emphasizes the purity of the soul and that it's God given. Now watch the next line 2. Line 2 is a remarkable exposition of verbs that all begin with the word letter ta. Ata, brata, ata, yatzarta, ata, nafachta bi, bata, mishamra b'ribi. So that line 2, the word ata is repeated over and over again, followed by verbs for each one. Brata, yatzarta, nafachta, mishamra. And line 3 starts off, ata atid litzcha mimeni. In the future, you'll take it from me. Ulachzira bi latiravo, and return it back to me. Every single expression ends with the opening of the mouth, forcing an exhalation and inhalation. You cannot say apta brata without breathing, ata yatzarta without breathing, ata nafachta bi. So as you say the prayer, one becomes aware of the inhaling and exhaling of the breath. And one recalls the verse from Genesis, that a God, nafachta, he breathed into us or inhaled into us the breath of life and made us alive. So getting up in the morning, one perceives one's soul as restored to him by God and becomes aware of it through inhalation and exhalation. And by exhaling and inhaling, it's like reliving the original breathing or inhaling of God into our body. Then line 3 says, in the future, you will take it. And in the future, you'll return it back to me. Now, what does the future mean? Is the future the next day? Or is the future the next life? So apparently the function of the prayer is to play on both, arguing that awakening is a miniature resurrection. And just like death is a miniature, just like sleep is a miniature death, the Talmud estimates it to be 1/60th, so is getting up in the morning a miniature resurrection. And if I can sensitize you in the morning that getting up is really the inbreathing of the soul into you, that it enhances the credibility that the resurrection, the soul again will be inhaled back into the body. So the line starts off, line 4, as long as the soul was within me, modani lefenecha, a line which became a separate prayer in the late 16th century. But as long as the soul was with me, I expressed what? Gratitude. And I referred to God as Ribon Kol HaMasim, which means he's the master of all deeds, Vadon Kol HaNeshamot. By saying Ribon Kol HaMasim, I'm underscoring that nothing is limited. God can do everything. Ribon Kol HaMasim. And specifically the case here is he's Adon Kol HaNeshamot. Now by being Ribon Kol HaMasim and Adon Kol HaNeshamot, I can rest assured what line 6 says. Baruch atah Adonai hamachzir nishamot lefigarim metim. That God will return the soul to figarim metim. Now, figarim metim is a very unusual expression. because Pegarim means dead, Metim means dead. Sometimes when you take two words who mean the same thing and you juxtapose them, you actually minimize them, like saying he's dead tired. When he's dead tired, he's not really dead. He's just what? Really exhausted. Now, this imagery of sleeping and awakening is reinforced in the second prayer, which I handed out for you. We'll put the two together. That is the second blessing of the Amidah, called Gevurot, the function of which is to argue that divine power exceeds any expression of human power. And the example for that is resurrection. So it starts off going like this, the second prayer. Ata Gibor, Le'alam Adonai. Ata Gibor is an expression of divine potency. What is the evidence of divine power in this prayer? Line 2. Mechaye mitim, Ata Rav Shia. So what can God do? Resurrect the dead. Now, if you look at the prayer, you'll see that the phrase for resurrection appears almost every other line. Line 2, it begins. Line 4, it's in the middle. Line 8, at the end. Line 10, they begin Lachayot Metim near the end. And line 11 again. So it's clear that the phrase 5 different times talks about the resurrection of the dead. But it turns out that it's actually an argument for the resurrection of the dead. It's important to read liturgy as persuasive literature. Ask, what is the thesis? What is it trying to convince me of? How does it convince me? So let's look at that methodology of how does the liturgy try to convince me of the plausibility of the resurrection of the dead. So, continuing with our analysis, we move to line 3. Line 3 talks about rain, the bringing down of rain. According to the Mishnah, we are required to juxtapose a prayer about rain with a prayer about resurrection. Apparently, the argument is that one of the arguments for resurrection comes from rain. Now, in Israel, you got 2 seasons, the rainy season and the dry season. In one season, things die. And the next seasons, things are revived. So now the argument comes from nature. If things die in the winter and they get revived in the spring, and how do they get revived? Because the seeds go underground. So they're buried in the ground. But when the proper nutrients and the rain hits them at the right time, then that seed is revived and comes out of the ground. So the argument goes, just like we see resurrection in the natural world, maybe we can see resurrection in the human world. And therefore, resurrection, or coming out of the ground, is like the seed buried in the ground. If the nutrients did not hit it properly, it would have remained dead. When the nutrients hit it properly, it gets revived and sprouts forth from the earth. Then line 5 is another argument. He gives us 3 miniature resurrections. What are they? Somech noflim, rofei cholim, umatir asurim. All these things, if left alone, would lead to death. When people are somech noflim, people fall, they remain fallen. Some never to get up. Rofei cholim is another reversal. People are sick. In antiquity, people got sicker and sicker. And before you know it, they died. Matir asurim originally was people thrown into prison. They would languish in prison and not come out. So what you have here is, in the words of Maharami Rutenberg, Techiyat HaMeitim Bezeir Anpin, means we have 3 miniature resurrections, trying to prove to the reader or the prayer that reversals take place. And reversals take place by virtue of divine intervention. So if reversals can take place by virtue of divine intervention on the miniature level, maybe they can take place on the macro level. So we have three examples. If these reversals can take place, maybe the grand reversal from death to life can take place. And that's why line 6 specifically calls dead people at the end, Shene Afar, borrows the language of Daniel, that people, I want to convince you that normally when you're dead, you're dead. But in the context of an argument of resurrection, you are slumbering in the earth. And then what does do? What will God do? Mekayem emunato means God will keep his promise, not his faith. The word emunato means his promise, his faithfulness. And if he promised something, he can be relied upon to keep his promise. So Mekayem emunato, he keeps his promise, lishenei afar, to those slumbering in the earth. Now, were God to pull this off, then everybody would say, Mi kamocha. Nothing is like this. It's unprecedented. Who is like unto you? Baal Gvurot, which means the master of the total expressions of power. Umido melech, nobody's like you. Now, line 9 specifically calls God Melech. What does the word Melech mean? Melech means sovereign. But in this case, it means there's no limitation on the extent of divine sovereignty. In almost all other ancient religions, there was a god of life and a god of death. We have Zeus and Hades, and the power of the god of life stopped at death. But God is Melech. Melech means there's no limitation on the expression of sovereignty. So not only can he be Memit, who brings death, what can he also do? Mechayeh, he can revive it. And now comes the powerful expression, the revival of a human being from burial is like the revival of a seed buried in the ground. So therefore, line 9 says specifically, matzmiach. Matzmiach is a word borrowed from the agriculture. Matzmiach means to cause it to sprout. What's the word to sprout here? What is going to be the cause? Yeshua. So the salvation will sprout forth from the earth. Thus, I play here on several metaphors. I'm using sleep as a metaphor. I'm using the revival of nature as a metaphor. And I'm showing examples where miniature resurrections take place in our daily life. So how do we conclude? Line 9 says, V'ne'eman ata l'chayot metim. Now the word ne'eman goes back to line 6. It's the second word there. Mekayem emunato. God keeps his promise because God is faithful. Therefore, ne'eman ata. We can rely upon you to do what? L'chayot metim, to resurrect the dead. And therefore we conclude the blessing, which summarizes it, Baruch Ata Hashem Mechayei Metim. Now what's remarkable about this prayer is if you compare it with the Christian arguments for resurrection, which are quite extensive in the 3rd and 4th century. After all, Christianity, the centrality of resurrection, even plays a more powerful role and consequential role in their theology than it does in ours. And they wrote treatises on resurrection. Many of the arguments there are repeated here. They're common to both traditions. The difference here is in this prayer, the only arguments used for resurrection are those which are available to experience. So, for example, the Christians use one on the waning and the waxing of the moon. They also use with glassware. But here, every single example is available to human experience, and therefore can play a part of the argument of persuading people of the plausibility of resurrection. So I want to summarize by saying the argument is made by analogy. The first analogy is rain, winter, revival in nature. And the second analogy is coming up after sleep. Therefore, the two blessings go together on resurrection. The first blessing, on top of the page, plays upon the awakening experience every morning and argues if it can take place in a miniature level every morning, maybe it can take place on the macro level post-mortem. This is made explicit in the second blessing, where people dead are called Shenei Afar, those who sleep in the ground or in the dust or the ashes. So the two blessings go together, reinforcing the belief in resurrection by trying to advance our sensitivity to the daily experiences which we have, which could point to resurrection. According to the rabbis, they don't prove it. They're only 1/60th. So we'd call them intimations of resurrection, reinforced by both blessings. So in summary, the function of resurrection is to convince us that the human being is constituted of both body and soul, and they're given equal weight. 2, that the body is neither the source of evil, nor is the soul the source of good. A human being is always an interaction of body and soul, and only together does the human being do good or the human being do bad. And therefore the argument is that it's not so much a theodicy, which everybody says, it's really an anthropology. It's trying to convince us religiously what makes the human being significant, and that all the elements there constituted create the human being. And finally, it's only together that they create the image of God. The image of God in rabbinic literature is not identified with the soul, nor with rationality. The image of God, which is called an icon, is identified with the whole human being, and therefore for the human being to retain itself as the icon of God, it must be reconstituted totally together again. And thus becomes our discussion of resurrection, its significance in the liturgy, its significance in Judaism, and why the rabbis deviated from the standard religious path of Neoplatonism of separating out by value body and soul and putting them together and making them of equal value.
Thank you. Obviously, I've said that bracha thousands of times and have never quite understood it in that sort of way. So I appreciate the deeper, really the deeper line by line understanding of it. I guess just in the minute we have left, I'm curious, you in with your rabbi hat on, different than professor hat on, how often do you actually talk about Tchiyat HaMetim from with congregants, and is this something that actually is part of your daily theology, even though obviously you say it a few times a day?
Well, first, I think as a rabbi, we should always rise to the occasion, which is what resurrection is all about. But I talk about it quite a bit because I think it's a distinguishing mark of Jewish theology. It's extraordinarily important that we understand the contribution that we can make to religious anthropology, in contradistinction to so many other religions which privilege the soul over the body, and in privileging the soul over the body or exalting the soul over the body, they feel that they degrade the body. Our religion, more than any other religion, has integrated the body, the pleasurable, and the sacred. Just take, for example, Shabbat. There's no holiday which is more bodily indulgent than Shabbat in almost every sense of the word. On the other hand, no holiday is called more sacred. Most people's understanding of religion is based on Yom Kippur, which is physical deprivation. And our religion is as much based upon the integration of the physical, the pleasurable, and the sacred. It's a remarkable contribution.
Thank you. Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach. It's been a pleasure.
Chag Sameach to you. And we are going to